Hey everybody, today I'm going to show you my tips and tricks for drawing cliffs and canyons. Let's get into it. So we're going to draw a canyon that is in a V shape that is going towards our horizon here. So let's start by drawing in cliffs in the distance on the left hand side here. Draw this line just short of the center of your paper here. With these cliff edges, you can be pretty loose with your lines. But a couple things to note about these cliffs in the distance here. While I am putting little zigzags in my line here to make it visually more interesting, note they're still pretty smooth because you're not going to get all those tiny details out in the distance. My line here is kind of light because from this perspective you'd have a little bit of that atmospheric haze where it wouldn't be super contrasty, it'd be more of a hazy light look. Now I'm going to start a new cliff's edge that will be closer in the foreground here. Let's draw one more cliff edge in the foreground here, and then I'm going to add even more little dents and bumps in my cliff edge. So this cliff closest to us will have the most detail. Okay, so we have the cliff edge roughed in on the left side of our canyon. Now on the right side I'm going to map in our cliff line, but I'm only going to do some cliffs out in the distance on this side. Again, I'm bringing this cliff edge just short of the center of my paper. And I'm just doing little zigzags that don't have a lot of small details in them. I'm going to leave this bottom right corner blank for now because I want to add a more dramatic cliff overhang. Now at all these points, we're just going to add a vertical line coming down. And remember, this cliff is far off in the distance here, so don't add a lot of bumps and ridges that would give it detail. Now a few things on these vertical rock walls in our foreground here. Start to add more bumps and ridges to give them more detail. Start to extend the lines longer. Now this point over here is just going to come down and tuck behind this cliff here. So that's all we need to do on that one. And then we'll come up here and add this one in. One thing to notice here is the bottom of each of these cliffs is always getting shorter. Again, that's to keep our perspective looking into the distance accurate here. So what's fun about drawing cliffs and canyons like this is with just a few lines, you already have the foundation for your cliff. Let's start to add some texture and shadows to our cliffs in the distance here. We want to keep our pencil values pretty light in our background here, again because we want to keep that illusion of sort of an atmospheric haze. So I'm just very softly adding in vertical lines coming down. I'm lifting my pencil up so I leave little gaps of white. As I get into this little nook here, I'm going to start to change the angle of my lines coming down to give the illusion of that curve in the rock wall. Not as much sunlight would get down in there also, so it'd be a little bit darker. Use the same technique on the other two cliffs in the distance, adding a touch more detail to each as we get closer to our foreground. On this cliff edge here, we can start to lose the hazy effect we've been working on and add more contrast by using darker lead. I'm adding some darker shadows to this nook in the rock where there would be less light. And then near the top of the cliff, I'm lightening my value here as some light would be hitting the rock here. On the front of this cliff coming down, I'm drawing natural vertical lines with little bends and hitches in them. And my horizontal lines are mirroring the curved cliff line at the top. So it gives the illusion as if the rocks are wrapping around here. This effect is enhanced by my vertical lines getting closer together, so as the rocks wrap around, they get skinnier as we see less of them. Another little trick here is I like to add these little lines at the top of the cliff edge that can act as cracks and texture in the rocks, but also connect our rocks and mark the change in direction. On this cliff here, I utilize that trick even more. Note how this little nook in the rock has a curve to it. So I want to enhance that and show how the rock wall is rounded here. So I'm changing the angle of my vertical lines going down. And then as we flatten out on top of the cliff here, my lines have little tails trailing off in the corresponding direction to show that curve. This cliff also has more of a corner rock where we go from darker shadows to light. So here my lines are forming more of a cube shape to show that change in direction of the rock. On the front of the rock wall here, again, my horizontal lines are mirroring the cliff line at the top in angle and direction, but I'm also putting little bends and hitches in them to give them a natural and organic feel like rocks have. This cliff is an easy one. The only thing I want to point out here is even though this cliff wall is mostly hidden, note the contrast between this rock face and the little nook behind it. Moving on to the next cliff, we're following these same techniques. Here are my lines showing the rounded shape in the rock wall again, with the little tails on top to show direction. My vertical lines on the front have a natural feel to them, and the couple little horizontal lines here are in unison with the cliff edge at the top. Okay, onto the front cliff here. There are lots of bends and curves in the rock here, but we're just going to follow the same technique of our vertical lines changing angle to give the illusion of the rounding of the rock. Since we see the full side of the cliff here, we can also shade in our rocks to further enhance those curves where the rock bends. So think of this little corner here, similar to the previous nooks we've worked on. However, we can actually see the rock inside here. At this bend here, our rock wall is going to fold back into shadows, but all the same techniques that we used on the highlight side are going to apply here as well. We're just going to shade our rock wall in. I'm going back here and just adding some soft shadows with my 4H pencil. I'm mostly focusing on where we go from highlight to shadow and just adding a sort of slight middle transition shadow to soften them a bit. Now with my 2B pencil, I just want to add some rock texture and add little cracks and such to give it more detail. I'm going to quickly just fill in the cliffs on the right side here using all of these same techniques that I've talked about. Okay, so for this dramatic cliff in the lower right, we're going to similarly start out by drawing our cliff edge. I'm drawing a lot of bends and curves in mine to give it a more dynamic shape. And then I'm just going to have it sort of trail off into the corner here. The next step is to extrude those edges that are visible from our perspective. You're just making a 3D shape out of those edges. Try not to let them all look the same, but if they do, no worries. Once we add some texture and shadows, that will give them some variety. Also add some more rocks underneath this, so there's actually something holding this cliff up. These are going to be heavily shadowed, so don't worry too much about the shape here. I'm going to add a few cracks on our ledge here for some extra detail. Now start to shade in the extruded rocks. I'm starting off light with a 4H pencil. On the rock below, I'm going darker with a 2B pencil. Remember here, the ledge would be shading all of these rocks below. Now with my 2B mechanical pencil, I'm going to add some fine details to my rocks to give them a more organic texture and feel. Okay, now at the end of our ledge here, let's put a little backpacking human overlooking our canyon. I'm not going to fill in the top of our cliffs here, but if you want to draw trees, grass, or rocks, etc., check out my playlist, Techniques to Draw Any Landscape, linked down in the description. But to keep creating that atmospheric haze look, I'm going to softly fill in the cliffs in the distance with my 4H pencil. Then as the cliffs get closer, I'm going to use a 2B pencil here. And lastly, a 6B pencil on this closest cliff. I'm also going to sketch in some lines here just to sort of connect our rocky cliff with some cracked rock slabs up top. Same with our ledge over in the corner here, just to give it some visual interest. A little grassy shrub. Adding lots of little details like this will really help your drawing shine. Cliffs like this are often loaded up with rocks at the bottom, so I'm going to throw some piles of those down here. Main thing to keep in mind here is your highlights would be on the top of the rocks, and then around all the sides of the rocks will be mostly shaded since they're all sort of piled up on each other. So don't get stuck on these too much unless you're going for a really finely detailed drawing. Now I'm going to fill in this section between our two cliffs here. All I'm going to do is show the trajectory of the bottom of our cliffs. Maybe if there are actually people still watching the video at this point, comment with what you would want to see here. and maybe in a future video I'll update this drawing. Now to finish our atmospheric haze in the clouds, oftentimes in a scene like this, the horizon line and sky almost blend together. So I'm just going to very lightly shade in a sky, and then I'm going to erase that back with my favorite tool, my electric eraser, so the horizon and clouds here blend together. Again, I don't want a lot of contrast for this hazy effect. If you want to see a more in-depth tutorial on how to draw clouds, check out my tutorial linked down in the description. And there you go, that wraps up how to draw cliffs and canyons. I hope you learned some good tips to help you bring your drawings to the next level. We'll see you next time.